Good afternoon, everyone. John said earlier that our research is the foundation from which we form our advocacy views, and this fact-based bulletin was produced to give us a more in-depth understanding of our ageing population. It's certainly something that's been talked about in the media and in political circles in recent times, and we felt that we really needed to get under the facts and figures for Perth. So to put it in context, I'd like to share just a couple of slides with you, and all of these are contained in the bulletin that should have been on your places today, and you'll also receive an electronic copy tomorrow. So by 2050, the most stark figure I think in our research says that by 2050, mid-century, we could have more than 1 million people aged over 65 living in Perth. And that would mean that we would actually have more people in that age group than in the age group in the under 15. So Perth really sort of prides itself on being a very young city and certainly a city for young families, and this sort of figure flies in the face of that. So looking at the first figure, the number of people aged over 80 in Perth and Peel regions has increased by a staggering 127% in just 2 decades. And there's been a 69% increase in the number of people in the 65 to 79 age bracket as well. But Perth isn't alone in this journey, this big demographic shift. The increase is in part a global phenomenon of population ageing due to declining fertility rates and increasing life expectancy. Our ageing population has implications for government and decision makers as well as the community as a whole. There's the key issue of housing, whether people will stay at home or need in-home care, move to a retirement village or perhaps even need a nursing home. And you'll hear from our keynote, Eric Lumsden, about planning for this ageing demographic and will be further discussed by our panellists. The increase in dementia and other health-related issues will put more pressure on our health system. An increase in the ageing population is also likely to create extra demand in our public transport system as the elderly forgo cars but still need to move around the city. And as the Federal Treasurer Joe Hockey announced last week, the eligibility age for the pension will rise by 2035, and then there's the issue of means testing a retiree's assets. When I was young, old people were just old. They seemed to fall into a very distinct group of grey-haired retirees taking it easy and enjoying their twilight years. But this is no longer the case. There are very distinct groupings emerging in the post-65 age group. Some young in mind, body and spirit who are self-funded, and this post-work period is an exciting time in which to live out the next phase of their lives. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have those that are dependent on government for the pension, healthcare and housing. And of course, there's everything in between. So my mother joins one of those that are young and old. She's just retired from an executive position after 50 years in the workforce in Sydney, is making the transition to country life in New South Wales and thinking about what the work opportunities might be there as well. Our chairman is no example of retirement. I think he's more busy now since he stepped down from a full-time corporate role than he's ever been before. But because the age cohort is no longer homogeneous, it will really create issues that are challenging in terms of setting policy that's equitable to all, and certainly financing those who need the most help is going to be very challenging to state and federal budgets. And it won't just affect the ageing population, it will affect us all because there's only so many ways you can cut the budget pie. In looking at the Perth metropolitan area, the fact-based bulletin found that over a 20-year period, there were only 3 local areas in Perth and Peel that didn't increase their residents' median age. The local areas that had the largest increase of 9 years were Joondalup South rising to 39 and Murray to 42. Joondalup North, Kalamunda, Mundaring and Peppermint Grove had a median age increase of 8 years, while Wanneroo South and East Fremantle increased by 7 years. Interestingly, Claremont, Nedlands, Peppermint Grove, Cambridge, areas in Mosman Park, Melville and Fremantle have the highest proportion of the population aged over 65, with between 15.3% and 19.8% of their residents falling into that group. Victoria Park has the highest proportion of females aged over 65 at nearly 60%. Fremantle has the highest proportion of divorced males, 65 to 79, and that's about 16.9% of their community. South Eastern Stirling has the highest proportion of homes that are retirement villages. It's well known that women live longer than men, and this chart shows the disparity in income levels between genders, which has the implications for quality of life and the standard of living for women as they age. And in terms of ageing as a couple, when we look at people aged over 80, 61.4% of them are women and 60% of them are widows. What this means is that older men will have a partner to look after them, but when a woman might need it, she may not. Moving on to the next figure. In September 2012, the Committee for Perth released Towards a Bright Future, a blueprint for Perth as a region of 3.5 million people. And we came to the conclusion that for Perth to remain livable, vibrant and sustainable as a city and region, business as usual was not going to be an approach that would help us. The report also said that everyone, irrespective of age, deserved access to the facilities, housing, public transport and healthcare that they needed, and this also includes our ageing demographic. We put it in the report that all people should be able to find their place in Perth. So in order for us to realise a bright future for Perth as a growing and ageing region, MPs, decision makers and policy makers need to be addressing these issues now so that we can cater for the needs of our community into the future. I think we're in for some interesting discussion today, so without further ado, let me introduce you to a man who needs very little introduction in my view, Eric Lumsden. Eric was appointed the Chairman of the West Australian Planning Commission in November last year, and prior to that he was the Director General of the Department of Planning. He has more than 30 years' experience in local government, having previously held CEO positions at the City of Melville and Swan, and he has been a Commissioner at the City of South Perth and the Chair of the Council of Swan TAFE and the Eastern Metropolitan Regional Council's CEOs Group. Eric's been involved in many of the major planning initiatives, including the Master Planning for Elizabeth Quay, the implementation of the Perth CityLink project, and he's a member of the committee overseeing the major stadia development happening at Burswood and also the precinct planning happening there. In my view, Eric is central in a position of power and influence to influence Perth and its future and coping with its ageing demographics, so please make him welcome.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this invitation. And I'd also like to thank the Committee for Perth for the opportunity to speak to you on this very significant topic. The reason it's significant is that many past commentaries have been about population growth. And it's only as in recent times that we've been focusing on not only population growth, but the demographics associated with that population growth, which are now growing in significance. And certainly I acknowledge the research that the Committee of Perth has carried out, because whilst I'm aware of demographics, I'm not a demographic expert, although I did study Demographic 101 in my Curtin studies for town planning. But I've become more conscious of the need to put this demographic issues in context, particularly in terms of ageing population. And the question is, how will Perth cope with this ageing population? And that is a very good question. It is a very complex question because there's many variables. And this is an issue for all jurisdictions, whether it's federal, state or local government, and of course the not-for-profit sector, and more importantly for ourselves as a wider community, as no one is immune from change, and you can see that by my grey hair. Population growth will continue. And whilst Perth's projected to have around 3.5 million, and that varies depending on who you talk to, by 2031, that should read 2031, that's only 17 years away. But in 2061, the population is projected to be around 5 million, which is 37 years away. But during that time, there's going to be very significant changes. And it's significant in terms of, as I said before, a national, state and Perth and local perspective. And I'd like to do a quote from the Australian Productivity Commission. Population ageing is largely a positive outcome. However, population growth and ageing will reflect labour supply, economic output, infrastructure requirements, and of course, government budgets, quite topical today. Australia's population is projected to rise around 38 million by 2060. or around 15 million more than the population today or in 2012. But most significantly is the population aged 75 or more is expected to rise by 4 million from 2012 to 2060, increasing from around 6% of the population to 14%. And yet in 2012, something we don't recognise perhaps as much as we should do, there was roughly one person aged 100 years old or more to every 100 babies. And by 2060 it's projected there will be around 25 such centenarians. Total private and public investment requirements over this 50-year period are estimated to be more than 5 times the cumulative investment made over the last half-century. Labour participation rates are expected to fall from around 65 to 60% by 2060, and overall labour supply per capita is expected to contract by 5%. Real disposable income, again an important topic based on the recent discussions in the media, per capita is expected to grow at 1.1% per annum compared with the average of 2.7% annual growth over the last 20 years. So collectively it's projected that Australian governments, and I use the word plurally, will face additional pressure on their budgets equivalent to around 6% of national GDP by 2060, principally reflecting the growth of expenditure on health, aged care and the aged pension. The ageing component affects this state, the Perth and the Peel region, but there's variability in the demographics and the profiles behind those demographics and of course their location. Hence there is over time a variability of economic impacts within the Perth and the Peel region. Let's look at some relevant facts. Let's say that the baby boom generation covers Australians born between 1946 and 1965, who will be aged between 49 and 68 this year, and I'm one of those. This lot numbers around 5.3 million. The preceding generation, let's call them the frugals, who were born during the 20 years between 1926 and 1945, and today are aged 69 to 88. But there's only 1.5 million frugals left today. Though 20 years ago, when this lot was at the same age of the life cycles today's baby boomers, they numbered 3.2 million. And this assumes that whatever pensions, concessions, benefits, retirement, housing and physical and or social infrastructure that was required to accommodate those 3.2 million prospective retirees from the mid-1990s onwards will have to be upped by 66% on the data I have during the next 20 years to accommodate the arrival of the baby boomers into retirement. And this assumes there is a pro rata comparison between what the frugals expected in retirement and what the boomers expect in retirement. We also note in a recent article by the Urban Development Institute of Australia that already the CBD of Perth is growing, with more traditional careers such as lawyers and accountants part of the ageing demographic, and jobs will be driven by emerging technologies locating outside the CBD and attracting younger people. But that also triggers future employment strategies, not only for the old, but also for the current X and Ys. I'd also like just to move on to some demographic profiles, which may be a bit difficult to read, but you'll get the drift. Potential issues for the metropolitan area. The top graph on the left, on your left-hand side, shows the change in retirement village, and this is only over the next 20 years. The next graph shows the change in state housing authority homes. The next shows the decrease in the aggregate household income. The next graph, the purple one, shows the change in nursing home places demand, and the orange one shows the change not in the labour workforce. The yellow one, a change in one-person residences, and the brown one, the two-person residences. And you can see the thickening. This is only to 2026, remember. That's only 12 years away of the ageing profiles that come through. But there's more significant issues in terms of Peel. I won't go through those graphs, but you can see the very significant thickening of the age profile in the age structure from starting from 60 to 64 profile in Peel around 2026. Then we break that down and let's look at a growing local government, one that's dear to my heart. You can still see there's impacts. Even though it's a growing local government and it will significantly continue to grow over time, you can still see on the right-hand age pyramid the issues of the demographics and how that will translate over time beyond 2026. Let's look at Vincent. Reasonably stable, but only up to 2026. After that, you see some trends going up, as you can see in terms of the yellow graph and the orange graphs, etc. But you can also see a significant change in the two residence households by the brown graph in the bottom right-hand corner. Wanneroo, another significant growth corridor, and probably our most important growth corridor over the next 20 to 30 years. But you can see how the City of Wanneroo needs to plan from a community planning perspective in terms of how that age demographic will translate over time beyond 2026. A significant issue for social planning in the City of Wanneroo, and you can also see the changes in the individual graphs I've mentioned before. Mandurah. I live in Mandurah, so does John. You could almost say on that graph it's a bit of a basket case. Without being discriminatory against myself or John. But you can see in 2026 how the fattening of that profile has occurred in Mandurah. Even though it's a growing community, it's the nature of the population growth. And that is also, at the moment, causing very significant cost and pressures on the City of Mandurah. But you can see how I'm demonstrating the issues which occur in terms of variability across the Perth and Peel metropolitan area. Claremont's another one where you can see Western suburbs. I chose a neutral Western suburbs council here, but you can still see the issue of ageing demographics there, let alone the ability to pay for asset expenditure, etc. And issues for City of Perth, which also indicates, whilst it's having a significant young age people moving into the central city area, it still will, in the longer term, have impacts for the City of Perth. And put more simply, you can see by this graph or chart that baby boomers are normally regarded as people born at the end of the Second World War up to 1963. There are alternative years given, but these seem to match the data for WA with just a dip after 1963. And this also tracks the waves, as I call them, of the baby boomers through the chart, so you can see the effect over time, a continuing impact. But what's even more importantly, if we look at this graph provided to me by the Department of Planning's demographers, in 1997 a report on the health and the quality of life for older Western Australians was published. And that's now some time ago, almost 10 years. This work was in response to changes in demand for health service for people over 65 at that time. This corresponds with those people born at the turn of the 20th century and may have been related to the Boer War, which occurred from 1899 to 1902. The size of anomaly is quite small, but did have an impact at that time in fostering a move to providing services at home rather than the hospitals. So, key issues are clearly housing affordability in the broadest sense of that definition. And I'll touch on the other topics on that slide, such as asset-rich, liquidity-poor, etc. In terms of housing affordability, the Australian Human and Urban Research Institute in April this year noted that an ABS survey of income and housing revealed that in 2011-12 financial year, nearly 1 in 5 of all Australian households paid more than 30% of their gross income, that is before tax was taken out, in rent or mortgage costs. In addition, the ratio of the median rent to median income paid by tenants who rented privately rose from 27% in 2012 up from a more affordable 19% in 1981. In 2011-12, 25% of lower income households, that is earning between 10% and 40% of the Australian household income distribution, which numbered in excess of 600,000 households, were in housing stress. This level of housing stress included 40% of low income households who are buying their home. Housing stress rates for low-income households have increased significantly since 1981-82, when 39% of households who bought a house in the previous 4 years were in housing stress. However, in terms of the latest figures I have, by 2007-8, that 39% had risen to 61% of households who bought in the previous 4 years were in housing stress. It is therefore not surprising that housing affordability issues have become even a mainstream concern. The UDIA recently published an article which said Australia is rated as unaffordable, and referred that the 2014 Annual Demographic International Housing Affordability Survey again ranks Australia as one of the most unaffordable places in the world, ranking equal second to New Zealand. Each of the 5 major markets in Australia was rated as severely unaffordable, and noted that housing affordability in Perth, whilst had improved to some degree, had also deteriorated since 2011. And rising wages and low interest rates combined with smaller product has perhaps contributed to that improvement. Equally, Bankwest, in a more recent publication, did note that whilst people can be asset rich and liquidity poor, that low-income households are falling behind all others at a faster rate in WA than Australia, which raises concern about those living in these households and a decreasing standard of living. And that also reflects on the ability for the aged, as they move into retirement, etc., to be able to fund their desired lifestyle. The Association of Superannuation Funds of Australia Retirement Standard recently estimates that a couple hoping to enjoy a comfortable retirement need at least around about $60,000 a year, meaning a couple would need a nest egg of around $1.5 million to enjoy 20 years of comfort. So what does this mean in terms of planning terms, in terms of housing, where they live, accessibility of services, etc.? In terms of the Commission, it's all about providing a choice, but an affordable choice. We need to meet the demand for smaller and more affordable housing by increasing the supply of 1 or 2 bedroom units in all areas, so people have a greater housing choice in terms of location, prices and dwelling size. The chart on the below left shows the very low supply of 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings outside central Perth. We are encouraging, as a Commission, on behalf of the Government, infill development. That is more new housing in existing areas, but we need to be looking at around 50% of new dwellings being in infill suburbs. We want this new development to be located, and this also relates to people who are ageing, near public transport, retail and other centres and amenities and services. This will help reduce their transport needs and therefore their living costs. There's also people who obviously want to age in place. Ageing in place, and this is important, appears to be the primary aspiration of current retirees, and I would say future retirees, with the emotional attachment to the family home, especially to those who have not divorced, and although that's still in strong demand. This group is very reluctant to move from their family home as it provides them with significant financial and, of course, tenure security. In most cases, the home is paid off, so there's not a great financial disincentive to move. Financial incentive to move. If they're not divorced, they're likely to have a great emotional attachment to the family home, and importantly, also to the local community. They do not see the additional bedroom space as an issue, as it gives them more room for hobbies. Now they have spare time, more room for guests or temporary residents such as grandchildren. However, they also may overestimate their fitness and capacity to stay in a family home, but will look for measures to help them stay at home. The age in place group, I would argue, is a major focus of the Commonwealth Government through Living Longer, Living Better aged care reforms, and especially the new home care packages program introduced on the 1st of August last year. Those reforms appear to be aimed at removing or delaying the need for older Australians to move into residential care. Then we have what we call the local adapters. This group are attached to their communities, but not as attached to the family home. They have or will move to something more suitable, probably prior to retirement. If the attachment to the family home may be low, either due to divorce, the desire to lock up and leave, for less maintenance or for better amenity. Their ability to be a local adapter is extremely dependent on the options in their local community. If there are few, then they'll be forced into ageing in place or may relocate elsewhere less connected to the local community. These people may also want a retirement village option, which is an increasing issue we need to plan for, but they may not have choices open to them locally. Due to the difficulty of assembling sites and established areas for redevelopment, either for new market-based group housing or for specialist retirement housing, this group may need to move several suburbs away to find a suitable housing option. And when I refer to local community, I also mean not only social contacts, but medical contacts such as doctors, etc. The scene changes are clearly more mobile. They are looking to rebalance work and lifestyle commitments. They may be moving to take advantage of lower land values and potentially lower living costs outside major cities, or may have connection to a regional location. Members of this group may be moving from remote regional locations to a regional centre, and we've seen that continually over the last 30 to 40 years in rural communities because those regional centres have better amenities, and we've certainly seen that in the Bunbury region. Conversely, they may be moving close to a major city to enjoy an inner urban lifestyle. This group tends to be married, have higher incomes and educational levels, and be more healthy. The group also tends to be younger retirees and may move again when older. But that group is also likely to be interested in master plan communities on the urban periphery, golf course estates, and I've seen that in the city of Swan, such as the Vines, and high and inner urban complexes, including retirement villages. Then we have what we call constrained retreat. Like those people ageing in place, those experiencing constrained retreat want to age in place, but for financial reasons have to make compromises. Many 50 to 69-year-olds are facing retirement with high levels of debt and little superannuation. Their relocation is driven by constraint rather than aspiration. This group's desire to remain in the same community is important. In general, this group prefers to compromise on dwelling size rather than location. If there is a shortage of affordable housing options locally, they may be forced to move away from family and friendship networks. There's obviously increased dependency. In the same way that financial constraints act on the last group, health constraints precipitate compromise in housing choices for increased dependency groups. With this group, health issues may not be able to be managed in the home environment, but the cost of hired help may be prohibitive. They may be able to become local adjusters if there's more suitable housing options available locally and if home help is available. Retirement villages with their range of housing options, from independence of an apartment in a multi-unit housing complex to a high-care nursing home or with adequate support in the family home, provide options for this group. However, research cited in the city's future study indicates that while a third of those 85 and over are moving to where they can receive care and support, 2/3 remain in the conventional housing market. So as the majority of baby boomers want to be looking for care until the 70s, won't be looking for care until the 70s at the earliest, all going well, we can expect them to be looking for care after 2030, but until then in a conventional housing market. And the last group is obviously the older renters. A significant minority of renters at retirement, even though some of these may have been homeowners through their lives, that percentage is increasing. In WA, 58% of public housing tenants are 50 and over. More alarmingly, over a quarter of those are on the wait list and particularly struggle in the private rental market. Mobile homes and caravan parks are providing some housing options, but we've seen an increasing number of caravan park closures. There are real concerns about what happens to these people when they can't find appropriate housing. In terms of other aspects on health, this is from our demographers a graph showing mental disability in relative terms. Because of the nature of the demographics, you can see how in the Shire, Murray and Kwinana, it's significantly increasing through to 2026. Whilst it's still increasing in Subiac and South Perth and Netherlands, it may have not such a dramatic effect in terms of numbers. In physical disability, again shows this issue, and you go back to those age pyramids I showed you in terms of Peel, etc. Murray growing quite significantly, as was Kwinana, but also in terms of Subiaco, South Perth and Nedlands in the western suburbs because of the age profile. Retirement village, self-contained, again a similar trend. This shows how change in age and sex structure would change an additional demand from, say, 4,000 people requiring self-contained retirement living. And in terms of state housing, again, similar trends. And these, in terms of numerical, thousands of people, but in their own dimension, they can be significant for even more, what I'll call stable demographic local government areas. So where will people live? As I've touched on, people need housing choice. But above all, they will need not only choice in terms of housing, but also accessibility to services. And certainly that will be an increasing issue, I think, in terms of, as I'm touched on, use of public transport, particularly in terms of using the transport network, whether it's light rail, but also, most importantly, bus service. And I think this issue has already been highlighted by some local governments where use community buses already to transport their elderly people around to various areas. I think this demand will increase, and local government needs to work effectively with state government in enhancing the transport network. In terms of retail and business locations, there will be more location and focus. Shopping centres are changing their trend to be more mixed use and more focused around transport hubs. And equally, from a commercial perspective, what they need to take into account, including particularly local governments, is the disposable income of many commercial areas at the moment will decrease over time. And that affects not only the viability of the council, but also the retail viability of business established there. Because in any shopping centre planning, you work on primary, secondary and tertiary catchments, and if there's a significant change or downturn in household disposable income, it will affect the private sector as well as the local government. And that needs to be taken into account in community planning, and hence why previous shopping centres really have to become sustained activity centres in a multifaceted context. The other issues, health and social issues, which I've clearly touched on, and other speakers will move in that area. And clearly this is now well and truly on the federal and the state agendas in the federal agenda, and it's about time. The last thing I think which we can bear in mind and use to help us are these things. Technology, smartphones. These can be used far more effectively for communication, for assisting people age in place, for linking to medical services, all those aspects which people will need and increasingly need to do so. The people who have smart homes are well advanced because they can do it now through their TVs, like I've got, that type of thing. But technology needs to be looked at a lot more closely on how we can address a lot of these issues in terms of helping people age in place. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Eric. We're going to start our panel discussion now, and best way of doing that is to introduce each of the panellists who can maybe spend a few minutes up here at the podium and bring their connection to the fore and obviously illustrate some of the things that Eric's talked and go beyond. Can I just also say that we'll have a discussion and hopefully get lots of interaction. I ought to just say there are media here, so if you could just say who you are and where you're from, that'll be great from a media perspective as well. So can I just welcome on stage our four panellists, Simon Newberry, who's the director at Urbis, Maxine Murray, she's the chair at PerthALIVE, Michael Heath, he's the CEO at St Ives Group, and Richard Gates, he's the head of healthcare banking at ANZ. If you could make them all welcome, they'll make their way up. And first to the podium will be Simon Newberry, who's the director at Urbis. We'll just have a few moments from each of them, and then we'll start our discussion.
Thanks, James, and good afternoon, everybody. I suppose I've just got a few minutes and a few slides to talk about some of the key factors from our perspective that we see underpinning the choices that older people make. Clearly, it's a pretty complicated issue with demographic, social and cultural factors all coming into play. These few slides just sort of go through the why people move and the where people move. So, first slide, I don't expect you to read all of these quotes, but this is some of the responses that we've had from surveys that we've undertaken about people's attitude to future housing. I think some of the key themes that come through are the wide variety of factors and issues that determine people's housing choices: safety, finances, friendship, health. There are a couple of up there that I think relate to what happens to the family pet. So after the event, once people have moved into alternative accommodation, this slide shows the reasons for moving from your previous address. And I think it's pretty clear from there that the highest weighted factors are all around push factors. And from what I've seen elsewhere on an international level, that differs somewhat from perhaps more lifestyle orientated or pull factors that are made elsewhere in terms of housing choices. And these push factors are also relevant in the reasons for choosing certain types of accommodation. I think the only interesting one there is how high up the quality and design of the retirement village actually rates. We've had a lot of discussion on the numbers, and there aren't a huge amount of numbers. This slide differs from the maps that we've previously seen about where the number of 65-year-olds live. This map is actually where those 65-year-old plus have moved, where have they moved to? And I think the interesting thing to pick out from this map is we can see around Bedford, we can see the influence of supply. So I think it's important to bear in mind, given the population pyramids that we've already seen, that their future projections based on a number of assumptions, and the retirement village industry has a role to play in where older people are located as well. It's where product gets built. I think we can also see a little bit of a historical place of residence influence there. The suburbs where people first moved and now live, they tend to move within them. I think perhaps some of the more wealthier suburbs, you can also see a trend there, people moving in there. And also, I suppose importantly, proximity to the CBD amenity and transport links is also relevant. So that's the where people move. In a product sense, people also have a number of different options of where to move, and this is enormously complicated in terms of the different options available, from standard retirement villages, sheltered housing, assisted living. And I suppose what I'm here talking about today is some of these other options that might eventuate to serve the need of the older population, because I suppose from a personal perspective, when we look on an international level, the availability of product is particularly limited in Australia. Take gifted housing, for an example. That's an emerging one in the UK, where a charity buys your home and undertakes to maintain it up to a certain standard and provide for your care. And obviously, co-housing, people grouping together to buy properties and subdividing mansions in Sydney to provide six little apartments and hiring some help themselves. So these are all trends that we're starting to see. I suppose turning to some of the key factors that we think will influence decisions and choices in the future. We've already had some quotes and sound bites. My favourite one there is, the first person to live to 150 has already been born. And just a couple more on perhaps the impact and consequences of these medical breakthroughs. So retirees in general can expect to live longer and in better health. Will this mean that they delay their entry to a retirement village? Will this drive new product offerings? I think that's all unknown at this point in time. But along with these medical improvements, we also have changes in wealth, changes in culture, changes in aspiration that, just talking to Maxine earlier, I'm sure she'll elaborate on. But I think the key message is that as reflected in the intergenerational report, that the baby boomers will enter retirement with different expectations and aspirations and is likely to demand higher quality and a greater range of services than previous generations. So how will this affect choices? Does it mean we'll have better quality options in different locations? Does it mean we'll have golf courses in retirement villages, larger retirement villages? I think in a global context, we can still see Australia is relatively immature in that context. And the other big issue of wealth. At the moment, a lot of the baby boomers coming through are particularly asset-rich, and they might demand a certain type of product that might be different from the generation following it, which might have reduced spending, reduced asset wealth, and by that time a higher cost of care. So hopefully this works, and this is certainly not a reflection of my future aspirations in retirement, but perhaps pulls some of the themes together about what alternative options might be for retirement housing. And Eric, this is another market segment which I've called ageing in another place.
Now, it's not everyone's idea of what to do at the end of your working life, but an increasing number of Brits, it seems, are being seduced by the prospect of spending their sunset years in the Thai resort of Pattaya. The numbers of British residents aged over 65 in the town has risen by 43% in the last 2 years.
And for an increasing number of British retirees, it's all affordable on a UK pension. In times of austerity, it's a powerful draw, and tens of thousands of men are making the journey.
I'm not sitting indoors with my slippers on. No way. This is my time.
If I were in England, I'd be sat in my room waiting to die.
But there's been a huge rise in the number of Britons taking Thai retirement visas. And in Pattaya, that increase is even bigger, up 43%. There are other ways to spend your twilight years in Pattaya. On the outskirts of town, a group of Scandinavians have bought their own retirement home and keep themselves busy in the pool and gym and at choir practice. Well, sort of. And it's got some politicians thinking, why not export retirees to Thailand and save the taxpayer money? Residents here think European governments should get on board.
They have to pay in any case for us in Sweden. If they pay for us here or in Sweden, it doesn't matter. It's the same cost.
So I think that's my 5 minutes up. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed. They're looking very attractive. Maxine Murray, Chair at PerthALIVE, is up next. Maxine?
Thank you, James. Is that at the right height? Can people hear? I represent the not-for-profit organisation PerthALIVE. As you can see, the Alive bit stands for all ages living in vibrant environments. We started out as a group of baby boomers, although we've now expanded to include all ages. But our initial baby boomer group wondered how we would live as we grew older. None of us particularly liked what seemed to be the two main options, although there are increasingly others. The two main options currently on offer, they were either to stay in our own home and have services delivered, or buy them in, or live in a gated retirement village with people of the same age. In the short time I've got today, I thought what I'd do is illustrate a couple of our ideas to show how providing a different housing option can also deal with the issue that's being asked of how do we provide adequate services for an ageing population. Obviously, I can only scratch the surface of the complex area, but I'll do this by highlighting how the work we've done on our ideal housing precinct is different from those currently on offer. Firstly, we're very clear we want higher density, mixed-use, walkable precincts close to established transport hubs and suburban town centres, specifically designed to suit all ages. And there's a general theme that's been running through today, and it always seems to be about the aged or the older people as if they were a group that all should be segmented outside of the community. We're really pushing the message that we want to be with all ages. We don't want to be just with people the same age. But clearly, if we wanted to live in all-age communities as a group of baby boomers, we needed to partner with some younger folk. So we formed a partnership with Future Perth. And for those of you who don't know, Future Perth is made up of a diverse group of enthusiastic young professionals who love their city and are passionate about what it can become. Their members and supporters are generally young singles or families, probably what we would call Gen Ys. They've grown up in Perth, but have often lived around the world. So are there specific design issues you would need to suit all ages? Here are just a few. Community facilities, such as children's playgrounds, art and craft studios. We would want flexible communal spaces, things like a central square, which could be used for a range of uses like book fairs or open-air movies. The design would need to embody universal design principles, and if there are apartment blocks, that there be a mix of 1 to 3 bedrooms spread across all levels. Secondly, we're very clear that we want to focus on social sustainability. So we want the design of the buildings and the outdoor spaces to encourage incidental encounters. So you do things like co-locate a cafe next door to a children's playground. What we don't want is an undue focus on security and exclusivity. Many of the precincts we've visited have such a focus on security that it dictates many of the other design considerations, and that doesn't create the kind of community that we're talking about. And thirdly, most importantly, we want the services that can support us and be available to us, specifically to allow ageing in place. And this brings me quickly to the issue of why our ideal development needs to be a large precinct, accommodating several hundred and up to 1,000 people, not just one apartment block. And that's the presence on site of services to meet our needs as we age. PerthALIVE approached an aged care provider who came up with a proposal that would see them having a presence on a site in such a precinct, and from which they would provide what they titled both support services and lifestyle services. The support services would be provided to, say, if 10% of the 1,000 people wanted it. They would include such things as personal care, medication administration, nursing, respite care, and escorts to medical appointments. Interestingly, it's become clear that the fee-for-service lifestyle services that they came up with as part of this package would be appropriate for residents of all ages. Things like cleaning, laundry, childcare, fitness, counselling, pet care and general maintenance. And we were very clear that while this would be available on site in our ideal precinct, we envisaged that these services need not be exclusive to residents, but should be accessible to the local community. And as part of the whole program of social sustainability, we don't want that exclusivity. We think the vibrancy comes from having the local community integrated into any development. To be quick, I should be very clear. Our group is talking about people who are able to accommodate and pay for their own lifestyle. However, we see no reason why this can't be adapted in public policy principles to allow the same kinds of living arrangements for people who may be not able to afford to house themselves in the current market. And I also should be clear that many baby boomers will want to stay in their own homes, and probably good to hear from some of our panel members, will want to live in retirement villages. And also many Gen Ys, probably the majority, will want to live in a suburban house with a conventional backyard. But what our collaboration has showed is that that's not the case for all. And what we're advocating for is diversity in the housing stock and indicating to all that there's an increasing number of West Australians of all ages who want something not offered by the current property developments. And the bonus is that it will help solve the issue of housing and adequate service provision for an ageing population. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. Michael Heath is the CEO at St Ives Group.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. I want to start off just by talking about one specific aspect of ageing, and that is the subject of dementia. It's a sobering fact that by the time I finish speaking to you today, another Australian will have been diagnosed with dementia. So every 6 minutes, someone in Australia receives that diagnosis, and by 2050, that's likely to be 1 every 4 minutes. So that'll be 7,400 new cases each week. Dementia is the 3rd highest cause of deaths in Australia, and if dementia was a country, it would be the 18th largest economy in the world. It's really a significant factor on how we cater for our ageing population, and it's something that we need to address urgently. Our organisation, St Ives, operates in a number of different areas. We are the 6th largest provider of home care packages in Australia and the largest provider of home care packages to the elderly in the Perth metropolitan area. So we have 1,500 people going into homes, helping people live independently, so those people that have been talked about that want to stay at home can do that. We also have our retirement villages. We have 8 of these villages that we either own or manage. So again, there's a cross-section of people who prefer that option. And almost 40% of our residents access home care services from providers like ourselves. We own and manage 2 residential care facilities. These were previously known as aged care homes or nursing homes, so I'll be using that expression, residential care facilities, throughout. Our residential care facilities are full. There's a waiting list. The only way to get into our residential care facilities is if somebody else dies. That's a fact. There's currently 15,000 residential care facility beds in WA. We need 18,000. 3,000 might not sound like a big difference unless you're trying to find a spot for your relative to go. And I'm sure a lot of you are in that situation yourselves. I went through this myself with my own stepfather. I visited him in a low care facility. Pleased to say it wasn't a St Ives one. I found him in his room where he'd been laying on the floor for a couple of hours bleeding. After attending to his immediate needs, I went to see the management of that facility and they told me that he could no longer stay there, that they were not able to cater for him. I then started to look for another facility for him. He'd lived in and around the city most of his life. The closest place I could get him to where he lived was 20 kilometres away. And my mother obviously had to make that trip to visit him. He passed away in that facility. Probably a good thing, because there was nowhere else for him to go. That's the sort of problem that we're dealing with at the moment. Our home care packages are almost all booked out, especially our high care packages where dementia support's required. There are simply not enough home care packages available to allow people to stay at home. The government has said that they want people to age in place to stay at home, but something has to give. People with dementia ultimately reach the point where they simply cannot stay at home any longer. The government's committed to 80,000 new home care packages across Australia by 2021-22. Is it enough? Simply no. They've also committed to residential aged care beds growing from current 190,000 to 265,000. It simply will not accommodate the needs of people in that age bracket. Well, you've heard lots of stats today, so I won't go too much over these. But we all have parents who are ageing, and even as I speak, we are all ageing. It's a much better option, ageing, than the other option. The number of Australians aged 85 and over is forecast to double in the next 20 years. Even more sobering, there'll be more people over the age of 65 in WA than under the age of 14 within just a couple of years. At least we'll have the upper hand. There's a tsunami of elderly people entering the system. That word tsunami is used, and I think the wave that we saw from Eric earlier showed that tsunami is coming. We at St Ives daily receive heartbreaking requests from people urgently requiring accommodation for their loved ones that we have to decline. As we've heard, the first of the baby boomers have already retired. They're looking for something more. Retirement living and residential care are forecast to go through annual growth of between 4 and 5% up to the year 2033. Baby boomers we have bigger expectations. We want our facilities to be more luxurious. We'll be looking for facilities that have private ensuites, secure gardens, personally tailored services, highly skilled care staff. So this will revolutionise a series of markets, but where will we put them? So what do we need to do? Legislative reform is obviously important. Recent changes to legislation in both residential care facilities and villages have actually made it harder to accommodate the demand, especially in residential care facilities, where the changes effectively stopped investment for a number of years. It's starting to move a little bit again now, but it does take between 5 and 7 years to find and plan a new facility. Building planning and community requirements are also very prohibitive. The time taken to gain approval, the cost of building residential care facilities, in some cases making them almost uneconomical. Onerous planning requirements to get villages or residential care facilities approved, and then of course there's the not in my backyard syndrome. We also need improvements in planning and development. There's a desperate need to free up brownfield space for residential care facilities and villages and meet density requirements and meet the market. It's really incumbent on planners now to factor in aged care just as they do affordable housing or public open space. It can't be seen anymore as just something that we have to add on. It needs to be integrated into what we're looking at. In recent times, we've seen such a transformation in the city of Perth, but who's going to continue to utilise those facilities if the people who are over the age of 65 have to leave the city to get the accommodation they require? Our customers overwhelmingly also tell us that they want to have a residential care facility located with their retirement village. St Ives is currently participating in a joint venture with Landcorp and Cedar Woods in developing an intergenerational project in Kareen, incorporating a retirement village and a residential care facility, a residential development, commercial development, similar to the types of things that I think we were just hearing were important to people, so that we have this intergenerational focus. There's an urgent need for that, and there's also an opportunity for that within the city of Perth. Our facility in Kareen already has a database of over 1,000 people wanting to move into both the village and the residential care facility, and that's not even due to open its doors until 2017. So, as I mentioned before, the tsunami is coming. It's already too late. It's time to get on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, Richard Gates, who's the Head of Healthcare Banking at ANZ.
My talk today is more from a financial point of view, obviously. The health sector, including aged care retirement, is obviously a significant focus for all the banks, including ANZ. ANZ itself has banked a lot of the large players in the health industry for many years, Ramsay, Healthscope, Sonic, those sort of names that you probably all know. Interestingly, from a financial perspective, the top performing stocks in Australia and New Zealand over the last decade have been Ramsay Healthcare and Ryman, who's an aged care and retirement living operator in New Zealand, and they've just recently started to do some projects in Australia. The significant point about those two operators is that they have grown their revenue and their earnings over the last decade consistently at 10% per annum. And in doing that, they've delivered increasing capacity, more beds, and in the case of Ryman, more aged care and more retirement units. So clearly they've jumped on the demographic piece and have delivered from a capacity point of view. ANZ's position also has a large footprint in the mid-market, and there are some customers here today: Continuing Healthcare, Berrington, National Lifestyle Villages, and also we bank the very large end of town being St John of God. Significantly, our debt footprint in the sector in terms of funding operators is a little over $6 billion. Significantly, 40% of that is actually to aged care and the retirement sector. And in that regard, interestingly enough, we've actually grown our lending volume 20% compound over the last 10 years in terms of supporting operators either buy each other or do projects. So it's been our strongest performing business by some measure. The balance of it is in the hospital sector and specialist health providers, pharmacy, diagnostic and the like. So from a financing perspective, in terms of the opportunity, clearly it's a massive market. In terms of size, the ageing market probably has about 1.2 to 1.3 clients today. You've got 900,000 in home care from community care through to HAC. You've got 140,000 people who live in retirement villages. You've got about 185 people who live permanently in residential aged care. And in addition to that, and I haven't put it up here, but I should because John Woods is here, there's about 100,000 people who live in manufactured home estates where it's principally an over 55s proposition, and inevitably in 20 years' time they will be retirement villages as people age in place. From a future demand perspective, over the next 20 years, the number of people, as you heard, consistently going to double. Now, I don't know any other asset class in Australia whereby you're going to get 4 to 5% physical growth in demand. People know that, they're getting on board. Clearly there are impediments that Michael spoke about, but that's part of the challenge in terms of delivering on the opportunity. In WA alone, I think today people over the age of 85 are 37,000, and by 2032 it'll be around about 100,000. The 85-year-old number is pretty significant because 25% of those people live in full-time residential care. It's a subacute sector, and it's an amazing opportunity if people can get the licences and build. And I think it's inevitable from a government perspective that the current licensing regime that's in place will have to be broken down to meet that demand. The residential aged care sector, according to ACFA, which is a financing authority that the Labor government set up, over the next 10 years has to build 74,000 new beds across Australia. That works out to be about $25 billion CapEx spend over the next 10 years. Not sure where that is going to come from. To this point in time, a lot of that has come from accommodation bonds that the residents pay. There have been some changes in legislation, and the jury's out as to whether or not those changes are going to see capacity delivered as required. In addition to that, by the way, I think the number is of the 180-odd thousand beds in Australia today, there's about 40% of them that are multi-bedrooms and probably 20 to 30 years old, which require significant refurbishment. So arguably they have to be redeveloped too, because obviously people's demands are very different to the institutional demands of the pre-World War II population. So again, another significant load. As Michael said, community care is forecast to grow by 40-odd thousand packages to 100,000 in 5 years. Retirement living itself similarly has got a 5% growth rate, and that requires 5,000 units per annum. I think in 2013, with the downturn in the housing market that's now recovering, I think there's only been about 500 units built, so massive undersupply in that area. The other observation too is that the retirement living market in Australia has 5% penetration, in the US it's 10%. So maybe at some stage Australian market will converge with the US market, which will see even more supply required. The other positive, and obviously there's a negative to the positive, is that clearly the government has massive fiscal constraint in terms of funding all this. It's on the page of the papers every day right now, obviously, because of the budget next week. The offset to that, and that's the challenge, is the increasing wealth of the population. In 2002, those over 75, their net assets were $140,000. By 2040, their projected net assets will be $620,000. So a massive shift, and obviously there are tails and upsides on that, but that is the opportunity, and clearly if we can sort out the funding mechanism, the view is that the user pays contribution will more than offset government's constraints from a fiscal perspective. So from a sector attractiveness perspective, I won't read through all of this, but in terms of the positives, you've got 70% of residential funding is government funded, and there's increasing capacity for co-payment, provided you can work out a funding solution as to how you unlock that, be it reverse mortgages or something else. There's a relentless 4 to 5% demand growth every year. You've got the benefits of licensing and regulation, which provides barriers to entry, provided you know what you're doing and you're a canny operator. There's lots of ways to make money. In terms of the aged care market itself, there's been a massive sort of blockage over the last 2 to 3 years because of the reform agenda. But since that point in time, there's been a lot of activity. Private equity players have come into the market. Not sure where that is going to end up. We've just seen the first aged care float, mob in Melbourne called Japara, who floated on an 11 times multiple, which is a pretty strong outcome. For them to validate that number, they've got to grow their stock by about 10% per year, which will be interesting. So, in summary, very interesting market, lots of opportunity if one can solve for the problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to each of you. Let's start the discussion, and I'll ask a few questions, and of course, love any questions from the floor as well. I suppose the interesting thing is if you look at other parts of the world, and let's just say, I don't know, a Greece or an Italy or a Spain, where family is very important. And maybe if I can start with you, Eric, the importance of, there's a microphone there on the table, by the way, you'll need this sharing it around. How can we change the family dynamic so that families are more inclusive of all ages? You know, it's one of those things in this sort of society, we're very good at saying, oh, it's too hard for us, you know, let someone else deal with it. How could we change that dynamic to make a big difference to some of those figures and the way that we're planning for tomorrow, do you think?
I think if we go back to the European settlements, they've been there for a lot longer and also have obviously a different housing stock to Australia, far more, I'll call it, variability in terms of density. And by density, I'm not talking about high density. High density to me is 8 stories plus. I'm talking about medium density, 3, 4, 5. People forget we went through what was called the nuclear generation, where everybody, because of Australian lifestyle, wanted to move away from family but still be close. That is not a normal cultural approach in terms of families, and we've seen that in terms of the different ethnic structures where there's still obviously very strong association with Mediterranean type families like Italians, very close within the family. I think we've gone through that phase for a whole range of different reasons. We're coming back to it now, and because we're coming back to it, we've been caught short. And I'll be blunt here. I think we've been a very selfish society.
Just trying to think, you know...
in some ways, I mean, there's been drivers for that.
Yeah.
But I think we've lived for today and not looking longer for tomorrow.
Do you think that might change? You know, we go in
I think it
cycles.
is changing. I think it is changing. I think because it has to change.
Also looking at the way that families are now, you know, anyone who's got children will know that by the time they're about 35, they eventually leave home. So maybe it's the same sort of thing in reverse. You know, Michael, have you got a view on this, the way that potentially this could change again as a sort of a trend?
Yeah, I think if we look at some of the other countries, so the Netherlands, for example, where large tracts of land have been set aside to care for people particularly with dementia. Humanitas is probably one of the better known ones. And what that's allowing people to do is to continue to live as normal a life as possible. So facilities like that have their own shopping centres. The residents are involved in preparing meals and carrying on everyday duties. So there are other countries out there who have certainly realised that this trend is coming and have moved ahead of that trend to make life as easy as possible. And that encourages other family members to come and be part of that community as well.
What about some sort of financial incentive that governments could offer or local councils could offer to encourage more of the elderly to move back within the fold?
Well, I think that's right. I think that's what I'm saying is that there needs to be some incentive to do that.
You mean financial incentive?
Financial incentive, or certainly the land needs to be made available for that to happen. So there certainly needs to be some incentive to do that for developers because they're going to require some sort of commercial return.
Simon, do you want to add a word on that one?
Of course, there are differences between nationalities, and there are cultural changes that have occurred over generations, but I suppose one of the observations I make, and again speaking from experience, we shouldn't forget the significance of improvements in healthcare here. So previous generations might have cared for their parents for a shorter period of time. We now have significant advances in medical care which require much greater intensification of the level of care and over a longer time period. So I don't think it's just that I'm mean to my parents or that we're mean to our grandparents. I think there is changes in the health system that have given rise to the system of outsourcing care for the elderly.
Maxine, you talked about the ideals, the sort of the way that you would like to sort of design this. What is the view on some of your members with regards to moving back with their sons, daughters, that close-knit family?
Yes, some of our group have said what they would like if there was a precinct like that. They could see themselves living there, and these are people often in the sandwich generation. Their children who are in their 20s living there, but also their parents could be living there. And so they've pointed out the less carbon they're using in visiting and having to visit their parents. So they see, as when you've got all ages, you actually can have multiple generations of the same family living in the same precinct.
It was interesting then that they wanted all ages. It wasn't just a case of hanging out with the elderly. They wanted the young as well in there. Why was that so important?
Our group's very clear that we don't want to be segregated as we age, and for many of us, we're very involved with our grandchildren anyway, but we want to be in a situation where they're all ages and there's plenty of vibrancy and everything we need is in 5 minutes walk. And when we talk to the Gen Ys in Future Perth, they said to us, hey, that's what we want.
So everyone probably wants the same thing, which is interesting. Those precincts you were talking about, can you describe what that precinct looked like? Is there a precinct here in Perth already that is your ideal?
There's starting to be, when we first met with Landcorp, they said to us, go and have a look at what's happening around the Claremont Football Oval. And that's a precinct where there will be probably more than 1,000 residents and a series of apartment blocks built around the old Claremont Football Oval. So when we're talking about a precinct, we're talking about something like that. But it's a perfect example because it's right on the railway line. It's right next door to an established town suburban centre, and that's clearly what we want because the vibrancy is already starting to be there. You're not having to wait.
How do we force that, though? I mean, it sounds like that's the perfect area, but how do we make that happen, or does the market just make it happen?
Well, in the Claremont case, and I think in a lot of the land around the suburban centres on the train lines is actually government owned, and so when we spoke to the Premier, he pointed that out, that it'll probably be Landcorp or MRA who'd be leading those developers, but they always then contract the work to be done by the private developers, and there's nothing to stop the private developers finding land. I read today about a group who are developing an area in Maylands, what was the old Ross Selvage. Those are all available for the kinds of development that we're talking about. So I think the market will say, yes, that's what we want, but also there's some public policy issues around making it happen. I
want to ask you all about housing by design. You know, back in the UK where I come from in London, anyone who's from there will know that the tower blocks were meant to be a great idea, you know, superb idea. Put them all in tower blocks, that'll keep everyone happy. Total disaster, but it was beautifully planned. It was debated till the cows come out. Yeah, that's what'll work. It didn't work, hasn't worked. So how do we know that if we talk about this and we come up with these great grand designs for all this, it's what the public will want?
Well, I think obviously we've got to ask people what they want, and you've obviously got a fair bit of information, and certainly there's a growing acceptance of the need for apartment development. Certainly not many stories high, but certainly apartment development's getting a growing acceptance. A lot of people like to come in and have a smaller type apartment so they can lock up and leave. So I think that the market will adjust to that, but obviously it's about asking people, and that's clearly what you've been doing, is getting some feedback. I would say on this issue of we're very much a supporter of integrating development. However, there is a section of the community who do want to be segregated too, and we have to be conscious of that as well. I mean, we often find in our retirement villages, we get feedback from some of our residents who say, we'd really rather you didn't let some of those older people in here. Thanks very much. We don't want the walkers and the wheelchairs in here. So it's about making sure we stay in touch with what people are asking for, and certainly with our latest development, asking people, are they comfortable with an apartment has been a big part of that, and there's a real growing demand for that.
What is your response to that? We don't want those types here.
We try to be inclusive.
Simon, what's your take on housing by design? Your idea of taking all the planning and the discussion and making it so that they'll come.
Look, I think density is important. I think flexibility is also important, and I look at it from. If we take the example from young kids, when I look at some of the residential estates around, and you see the open space provision and the play equipment that they put there, it's only ever relevant when you've got young kids for a period of 1 year.
Yeah.
And then it's either too young or too old or not appropriate. So I think perhaps the same thing applies in some of our urban design elements, that they need to be flexible to change, and that flows through to the planning scheme, the design, the construction, and all sorts of things.
Richard, what about the health side of this when we are designing it? We obviously, the health playing a vital part as we age. What comes first? Would you be putting the health centres in first and then building the communities around it, or is it the other way around?
Well, I mean, look, that obviously is up to the developers, but from our perspective, if you go and look at a sort of retirement village development or whatever, and people haven't hard-coded in ageing in place and a certain number of rooms that can be what we call 9C compliant, so can deliver 24-hour care with government subsidy, we sort of ask a hard question as to how much forward thinking they are doing in that regard. Or conversely, you know, you'd like to think that they do have serviced apartments or a provision for residential care in situ. So it's really, you know, where they think they're heading and how they understand their demographic. That's part of the conversation in terms of the needs of their resident.
Mm. Eric, all those facts and figures at your fingertips and at your disposal now, we can look at those figures and we can say we better plan for 20, 30 years from now based on 2014. We don't know what it's going to be like in 2034, for example, 2044. We might have totally different desires and tastes. So how can we have that planning in place and yet still maintain some sort of flexibility so that when things have changed in 20 or 30 years, we can adapt?
I think this not only comes back to the private sector, but and obviously state government, as Maxine said, from a policy setting point of view, but also to local governments. Now, there are a number of local governments, and there's some in this room, who, other than just simply town plan, as I call it, actually do community planning. And I've always been a strong advocate is you plan for the community over time, and you then make sure your scheme, which underpins from a land use point of view, is flexible, but also need to take into account your program delivery, which will change over time with demographics, with a degree of flexibility. And this, I think, reinforces what the government has been trying to say to local governments who have the capability to do it, is to link that community planning with appropriate financial planning. So you build in the flexibility from a policy environment, from a planning environment in terms of both social as well as land use, and also then make sure your planning instruments do have a degree of flexibility so they're not as rigid as the issues we confront today.
Anyone else want to have a view on that? You know, what does the future look like? Maxine? Okay. Just can I just give that microphone back to Eric 1 second? I just want to ask him about that.
I'd just like to make one point.
Yeah.
I seem to think people seem to forget, depending where they are in their age in life, that they will get older. I think that's a sobering thought, which is becoming more apparent now.
It's true.
Sorry, James.
I was just going to talk to you about that technology thing. You talked about how we're planning for 20 or 30 years ago. 20 or 30 from now, 20 or 30 years ago, we didn't even know about things like smartphones or the internet or anything like that. That has come along, has changed and dramatically changed things. Who's to say in the next 10 years, having made all these great plans for the cities of the future, we haven't seen some other technological advance that blows everything else away?
Well, I think, you know, it's very hard to envisage where technology is going to be in 20 years' time. But what's become very apparent, like smartphones and smart wiring in homes, is there, and bearing in mind that type of infrastructure in homes is not just there for 5, 10 years, it's there for 30 years. So I think we need to encourage where possible flexibility within the housing estate, but also the housing design, but also need to build in that smart technology, because the demand in health services we can see in the state government and in federal government is spreading, you know, exponentially. And also the health services can get to very acute stage, but also people are living longer, but also it's an advantage for people to stay in the home with their community. Now, you can use technology far more effectively. I know the health sector, through medical people I associate with, are looking at delivering services through smartphones or through smart TV. I mean, people use Skype to communicate across the world. I think there's those type of potentials which we need to look at far more effectively to not only enable people to remain independent, but equally, I think, days of governments, in my view, personal view, of building very large mega hospitals is gone. So we've got to look at other approaches on how we deliver that type of service. The same applies to education. People still want to be educated, even though they're old. I noticed, I think it was UWA had a 90-year-old graduate with a master's.
Yeah.
So that's the type of thing of supporting people's independence, whether it's from a health perspective, whether it's from servicing. You can, online is another, I won't call it phenomenon now, but issue it's being where people can get delivery. So I think we've got to think ahead and build in as much flexibility without having a rigid thought and looking in the rear-vision mirror that tomorrow is going to be the same as yesterday.
Michael,
that's the challenge.
Michael, from a business perspective, how can you embrace technology today to make greater economies of scale and efficiencies?
Yeah, look at the sheer lack of resources is dictating that anyway. I think that's only going to grow, particularly in remote locations. Actually having home care delivered by an individual is logistically becoming more and more difficult. So that's one way in which we're going to have to embrace that technology, and it's starting already, and some of the things that Eric talked about are already happening. But I think in the same, and the question you're asking is, you know, we can't predict the future, and we can't, but we do know that people are going to live longer, and with that comes a whole new set of problems like dementia. And so that is a real issue because we live so much longer. Right. And I think that's the one thing we can be sure of, is that we're going to live longer, and there'll be new things uncovered that'll come out of that. Some of them good, some of them not so good.
We talk about greater demand as we all get older. One of the things that we are going to need is probably more people to look after us. That is an issue in itself, isn't it? Because it's not necessarily regarded as the sexiest job to look after the elderly. How do you cope in that space?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. Obviously, we try and build a culture in which attracts people that want to work in that industry and make it a rewarding role. But it is going to be a big issue going forward. Probably some of the drop-off in some of the sectors, like the mining sector, have helped a little bit. But it is going to be more. It is going to be an increasing problem. Certainly, the shortage of registered nurses is beginning to bite, and there's no real easy way to deal with that. It's a matter of trying to make your organisation an employer of choice and establishing a culture that people want to work in.
Sam, do you just want to add something?
Yeah, just I think a couple of points following on from that, and I suppose speaking from personal experience again and anecdotal evidence around Perth in particular, we are seeing an increase in informal labour supporting elderly people. And often these come from people with different cultural backgrounds who are much better and more able and willing to assist. And I think there may well be regulatory changes around allowing more people to come in and assist people in their homes. And I think the other element is going back to choices of people. As people live longer, we might well see the emergence, as in Scandinavia and Switzerland, of people making life choices about how long they live with certain conditions. And I think the developed world can't avoid some of those big questions.
Can I just add?
Yes, of course you can.
The next project that the Committee for Perth's doing, I hear, is something to do with gender, and I don't think you can have this conversation about the workforce to support an ageing population without having a discussion about gender and about pay rates for what is a fairly feminised industry. And it may well be that in the future the people in the service industries are the people who are well paid, not necessarily the people who are in the extractive industries, because if you get a shortage and there's going to be a crying need, you're going to have to address the issue of the poor pay rates and the gender difference.
On that note, how do we make working with the elderly, or the elderly sector in general, sexy? Is it possible? Because it is one of those things that if people perceive it as a sexy industry, you know, sometimes people think that the media is a sexy industry and no shortage of people want to work there, or mining or whatever it might be. How do you get working in the elderly sector to be sexy?
Look, it's not going to be a sexy industry, but it attracts people with a nurturing, caring nature. And I think some of the points that you've just raised about that they might come from other cultures, from other countries, is really important. And embracing that is important. So it's not going to be sexy. It won't ever be that. But but there's a whole bunch of the generations coming through that are not looking for that type of work either. And we're very encouraged with some of the people coming through that we see that see very much that they're looking for work that is more rewarding, and they're looking for that rather than all being about the dollar.
But it'll never necessarily be well paid?
Well, I think it's going to have to be, there will have to be an improvement. There'll have to be a change in the balance there eventually. But to be better paid, then there has to be some give somewhere else along the line so that organisations can continue to improve the bottom line. Richard Gates, let me ask you about the numbers side of things. We're not talking about it necessarily being a sexy sector, but it makes good financial sense, as you just talked about, a couple of interesting examples of how it makes great financial returns. In that sense, it's a terrific proposition, isn't it?
Yes.
So why, if that is the case, is it just purely from a business case? It just makes a good business case, but not much else, just because it's an inevitability. It makes great business sense. So there are investors wanting to get into the market. It's obviously a highly sought after. Obviously, you can just see that the examples there, the share price is going up. But with that in mind, can't the market just control us? Couldn't that just, for example, really help issues? The private sector coming in and saying, actually, this could be a great return. It's super. It's going to carry on for years.
Well, that's obviously happening. And I mean, one of the interesting issues is in terms of the fragmented nature of the industry being very cottage, historically, and it's increasingly corporatising, both in the for-profit and not-for-profit sector. There are clearly a lot of large players now who are heavily automated in terms of how they run their businesses relative to government subsidy claiming, rostering, and the like. The massive scale operations. So clearly, that's been a massive issue. Right now, by way of example, I think in terms of residential care, you've got something like 1,250 approved providers in Australia, and I think 650 of those are single facility operators, and there's probably another 200 who are ones and twos. So, about 800 operators out of the 1,250 are really quite small and are probably cottage in nature, be it a not-for-profit or a for-profit operator. So that is the opportunity, as they will inevitably roll up as the government turns the screws on funding, because the only way that you can make money is by becoming more efficient. Obviously, in certain cases, the mums and dads who run a facility, work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's how they make their money. But you can't keep on sustaining that, particularly from a compliance perspective.
Interesting. Anyone else want to add anything on? Interesting. Any questions from the floor? Thank you very much. We're going to have a microphone just come your way. Just one thing whilst we make our way around. The idea of retiring overseas, in that video we saw that idea of going off to Thailand. Is that what a lot of Australians will be doing, do you think? Anyone want to? Appealing, actually?
I would suspect that the people in our group, PerthALIVE, our whole point is staying close to family, close to home. We would feel completely cut off if we moved to another country. I did notice that in the video that you showed, it was mostly single men who'd moved.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Who's got the microphone? Someone down.
She's absolutely right. And if anybody wants to have a look, Channel 4, there's a 7-minute clip that gives you the full picture. So there was a much seedier side.
Was there? That was the clean version, was it?
To the video. But I think the important thing, and it actually did go on to say how it wasn't working out and how it's a strange sight to see old Western men living rough in Pattaya. And the point being, and the message being, that there wasn't the choice, option, support available at home.
Yeah, and it's always cloudy and rainy, and that was a very sunny option. Maybe Perth could do that. Let's have a question there.
Thank you. My name's Linda Wayman. I'm with Southern Cross Austereo and a board member for the Committee for Perth. Eric, I just thought I'd ask you, given Michael's comment that it can take 5 to 6 years to get planning approval for a residential or aged care facility or retirement home, why does it take so long, and do you see that as a major blockage for further investment and indeed for addressing this issue of ageing?
The answer to the last part of the question is that yes, it's too long. I think the major issue is lack of flexibilities in local government's town planning schemes and the process they go through. And also, to be fair to local governments, sometimes they get an adverse community reaction. They see this as, I think someone mentioned, don't want the oldies around with the scooters and whatever. We're going to address that in the new model scheme text coming out at the end of this year to make it more flexible. And also, I think one of the other issues, which quite surprised me, is the variety of definitions for this type of accommodation within schemes, and we need to get back to a more generic definition across the board in terms of local government planning schemes, so you can't get caught up from a definitional point of view, but then also we need to have the land uses ensuring far more ability to approve these developments rather than being tied up with what I call bureaucratic processes, and I'll be blunt here, and manipulation of those processes. Okay?
Short version. Yeah. Thank you.
ML McDonald. Does that work?
Yep.
ML McDonald. I'm a CEO of a not-for-profit developer and provider of a whole range of the services you've talked about. What I'm interested in is Richard's comments in relation to what we find is that there's a real gatekeeper situation that happens in retirement living, and that's people trying to shed their house in order to get entry into one of these types of living. And there's very little product that's available in the finance sector for them. And so I'm wondering what's happening in the banking sector, because that's one of the gatekeepers. How do they free up that asset to be able to buy into retirement living?
Well, I suppose the obvious answer is they sell their family home. And if they don't have a family home to sell, then they're obviously in the sort of the poorer end of the equation. And it's a social housing solution if they can find social housing. I mean, the difficulty for a bank to lend money on a retirement village unit is a couple of things. Typically the people are retired, so they don't have capacity to service. You then get into the reverse mortgage issue, and the reverse mortgage issue is incredibly difficult because if somebody's going into a retirement village at the age of 72 or whatever, okay, at 82 it's probably okay but at 72 a real issue. Then you get into age discrimination issues. If they're going to live for 20 years, a reverse mortgage will gobble up all their equity and we'll go into negative equity territory, and our shareholders don't like that. And the other issue too from a retirement village issue, which is really, really hard, is that the solution is that you have a big corporate solution. So in other words, if it's a Stockland or somebody like that with a big balance sheet who we sort of go, hey, there is a buyback liability or whatever the case may be, we might fund it. But for a single village operator, we are left with being reliant upon the capacity of that operator to keep on running that village over the next 20 years while that resident occupies it. And who knows if that village is going to be in the state it is in 20 years' time. So from a risk perspective, it's virtually impossible to solve, unless you're a really, really big operator and a big balance sheet. And that's why the reality is that, there are sort of certain small boutique developments in retirement living or in aged care that make an awful lot of sense because they're really well located, really well developed, good operators. But that's that end of the equation. If you're a single operator without a big balance sheet, without a proven track record, it's very, very hard.
How do you see it as a sector? A safe bet? A risky bet?
Okay, there's an element of the market that is problematic, and there is an element of the market that is entrepreneurial, and there is an element of the market that is big scale, can be relied upon.
Now, how do you see it? That was the question.
I'll have to go to Tony Abbott's mode here. Clearly it's a incredibly strong sector if you're selective. I mean, you know, the number of people who have made a lot of money over the last decade in all 3 areas and 4 areas: manufactured homes, retirement living, aged care and community care. I mean, community care is a late starter, admittedly, is significant. Those people who've been in there for 20 years, if I counted up how much money people, you know, in excess of, I won't say a number, but many millions of dollars, there's a lot of people out there who've done very well.
Yeah. Who's got the microphone? Any questions? Yeah, one over there. Thank you.
My apologies, I have laryngitis. I hope you can hear me. My name is June Lowe. I'm from the LGBTI Rights in Ageing Incorporated. I think I'll start by taking issue with the title. How will Perth cope with its ageing population? How many other people picked that? Are we coping? Are we capitalising? Are we making the best of? Or even turn it on its head? How will the ageing population cope with Perth, which has been left to developers and financiers and frankly isn't very livable? I'd like to, I suppose what I was hoping was more of a discussion, which Maxine has started with, on age-friendly communities, John, and also dementia-friendly societies, which there is work done more in Europe, I believe, but we didn't go there. I know I walk around my suburb and I see increasing numbers of the McMansions going up, and I kind of undress them and think, well, that would cut up very nicely into 5 sort of, you know, little apartments for myself and, you know, 4 other people who are ageing in one place. And yes, a cottage industry, I think, and perhaps a micro cottage industry. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that among people of my demographic. I don't think that the corporate solution is likely to be my solution, thank you, because it seems to me that you have diminishing autonomy, and that the risk perspective from a consumer point of view is frankly too high. So I think that I do come from a sisters doing it from themselves, for themselves generation, and brothers doing it for themselves too. And I think that if we want to have this sort of aged care and healthy ageing environment that we want, we are going to have to do it for ourselves, because I can't see the current systems even coming close to providing it. And I'm not seeing that kind of vision here at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric, do you want to comment on that?
From a land use planning point of view, I don't think you can easily resolve that. I'd say it's more of a cultural perspective. And I'll give 2 examples. One from when I was a kid. My mother and father formed part of what I call the original Meals on Wheels in Subiaco, where there was a lot of elderly people in the street. The demographic profile of that street, by the way, has changed quite significantly since I was brought up there. But they actually supported each other, a bit like Maxine was saying. In terms of the current community I live, down in Mandurah, there's a lot of support. We have an elderly gentleman there at the moment, 73, who's had problems with his legs. My wife's been supporting him, all the people bound around support him. Yeah. And so that's a cultural thing. I think if you have a community who just don't want to recognise their neighbour, which also recognises that they may be in that position someday down the future and say it's someone else's problem, that's an issue we're going to have to deal with as a society. But I do see a change in the community down there. We've had a number of people, fortunately my wife and I are in pretty good health. I'm ageing, but there's a lot of community support there. So I think that recognition is coming through.
Maxine, that the importance of community is really critical, isn't it? And it's across the board here.
Yes. Our group talks about we're as interested in creating a community as we are in building a building. And that's a real focus for us, how you design the urban environment to allow for that, what we call those incidental encounters.
How do you do it? Do you sit down with a cup of tea and come up with a plan?
No.
Gin and tonic?
No. There's a lot of research around about how you design the buildings. Just to give you an example, and we're very clear, we don't want to drive into the bottom of a dark car park in in an apartment building, get into a lift, press a button, arrive at an airless corridor and into our unit and not meet anyone on the way. And some of the developments we've looked at are just like that. But you can design it very differently so that in all of those things you do, you have an encounter with someone because you just happen to bump into them. There isn't an airless corridor. There's a colonnade that overlooks a central courtyard, for instance. The public spaces are made so that when you go and get your mail, you bump into people. It's not all behind gated security. And can I just address the issue that, I'm sorry, I missed your name, but that the previous questioner asked. I have to say, the PerthALIVE experience has been that the developers and the corporate sector are very interested in what we're talking about. They're not dismissive. I have been amazed at how we have been received with open arms. Please come and talk to us. Let's have a discussion about this. So I think perhaps you're a little pessimistic about how some of the major players want to be creative around this space.
So some of those ideas that you just described, you will put those into the mix, and you think taking those ideas on board?
Our discussions have been that there is a great openness to that. I mean, clearly developers have to make a profit for their shareholders or for their business, but I don't think it's a case that they should be demonised. What we're talking about is doing things in the open market, so we don't have that issue that you have with retirement villages and funding. These things are in the open market. So we have found that a great responsiveness that perhaps we weren't expecting, and it's been very welcome.
I suppose just a couple of observations following those comments. Whilst I can certainly understand the sentiment, I do also think that retirement villages in an Australian context seems to have sometimes a negative connotation. And as we saw from Richard's numbers, looking at the states at 10% and having double the propensity to live in those things, they're not necessarily, they don't have those negative elements elsewhere. And whether that's because they are more mature markets where they have a greater variety of product and they call them not just a name, but they call themselves a lifestyle village, but they do have a much broader spectrum, I think, of retirement village product, and it doesn't have the same negative connotations that sometimes it's referred to in Australia.
Look, I think it gets down, unfortunately, to capacity to pay from a resident point of view. There is some fabulous product that corporate developers are putting on the market, are building in well-located inner metropolitan areas in Sydney, which is a combination of 5-6 level retirement apartment and residential care. It's amazing product, but unfortunately, to get into that, the average entry price is probably $600,000-700,000. Again, from the people who live in those suburbs, the average house price is 1.5, so they're okay. But then when you get into Domain Principal, who are 50% owned by AMP, part of their model is very much the dementia-centric residential care model. They are targeting a concessional ratio in a lot of the new product they're building in the outer suburbs of Sydney at 40% concessional, and that's a corporate play. It's to do that, they're obviously incredibly efficient. It's very, very hard to to make money in residential care unless you are incredibly efficient. If you're not efficient and corporatised, you'll struggle to continue for the longer term.
Can I just, one final question, because we're just running short of time. The idea that you mentioned there about the McMansion getting ever bigger here in Perth, there are plenty of them. What about local councillors recognising that some of them could be divided up into 4 or 6 1 to 2 bedroom apartments instead of one huge property? Is that a doable plan, do you think?
Just very quickly, Eric, I heard a presentation, and I can't remember if the mayor from the city, from Cambridge, is here, but I heard a presentation from the architect that you hired to do a whole lot of development of what they called elastic housing. And it was just that, about you could have 2 units that could be one, you could have granny flats with a whole range of options that you could build even with current planning regulations.
And that would make a big difference quite easily, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, as Maxine said, that's a possibility, but where there's previously been problems under the Strata Titles Act. We're trying to free that up as well. So I think government is recognising there's need for more flexibility where appropriate, apart from what Maxine said in terms of developers themselves.
Thank you. We're going to call it a day because we've got to move on and get everyone back to work. Can I just say a big thanks to all the panel. Please show your appreciation. Thank you, Eric, as well, for your keynote. Simon Newberry, Maxine Murray, Michael Heath and Richard Gates, thank you very much indeed this afternoon. That's just about it. I want to introduce you to John Smulders now, the Executive Director at Georgia, to wrap up and get his thoughts on the presentation as well. John, thank you very much.
Oops. 18-point aerial and glasses. What's this ageing thing all about here? Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to propose this vote of thanks to our guest speaker and our panel members. As a developer and as the son of ageing parents in their 80s, one with end-stage Alzheimer's, this topic of discussion has been one very close to my professional and personal heart. Irrespective of our professional backgrounds and fields of endeavour, today's subject is one that involves us all, without exception. We're all a day older than we were yesterday, a day younger than we'll be tomorrow. There's little doubt that one of the things we all aspire to in the years ahead of us is quality of life and choice. A breadth of choice in how and where we live, how we interact with one another, and how we continue to enjoy the many wonderful benefits of this tremendous city. Whether we're a city of 3.5 million or 5 million people by 2050, there's an enormous challenge ahead of us in terms of accommodating substantial population growth whilst meeting the needs and aspirations of an ageing society. On behalf of Committee for Perth and all of us here this afternoon, I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Eric Lumsden for taking time to speak to us about the change in demographics and land use planning implications for our ageing society. In his role as Chairman of the West Australian Planning Commission, Eric has a tremendously important part to play in the future of Perth and how we plan for the considerable population growth ahead of us. Thank you for imparting on us your knowledge and experience in this field, and we all look forward to participating in this important ongoing discussion and debate. Eric, I'd like you to receive this gift from the Committee of Perth for Perth as a token of our appreciation. I'd also like to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation to our panellists, Michael Heath, Richard Gates, Simon Newberry and Maxine Murray. Our four panellists represent a wealth of experience and perspective on this topic, and we're indeed very fortunate to have them spend time with us this afternoon. So to Maxine, Michael, Richard and Simon, please accept a small token of our appreciation as we thank you for participating in today's event. Thank you. To James Lush, thank you for providing your MC services. And lastly, but just as importantly, I applaud Marion Fulker and her team who have planned and executed yet another outstanding Committee for Perth event. And on behalf of us all, I extend our very sincere gratitude for hosting today's lunch. In closing, I'd like to share with you a takeaway from a panel discussion that took place, and I know a number of us here were at this particular event. It was a multi-unit residential conference here in Perth only about 6 weeks ago, where the Mayor of a Western Suburbs Council said, and I paraphrase fairly accurately I hope, we don't really need any density in our local government area. We're quite happy with what we have now. If our ageing residents are looking to sell their quarter-acre blocks and downsize to a different form of accommodation and a different style of living, there are plenty of flats and things elsewhere in other councils they can move to if they want. And I'm not kidding. To me, the underlying sentiment there was, there's no issue here, and even if there was, it's someone else's problem. Local adapters, look elsewhere, please. Well, that sentiment presents a problem for all of us, I think. And it's incumbent upon all of us here to inspire and foster intelligent discussion on this subject, encourage forward thinking and strategic master planning, and demand quality design outcomes and a diversity of living and affordability options for West Australians of all ages. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you and good afternoon.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Can I just say well, that's very apt as they went off with their wine, to link in with our next address, which is on July the 1st. It's a Perth In Focus event on liquor licensing reform, which should be good. Keynote address being provided by Jill Stark. She's the author of High Sobriety. A Year Without Alcohol should inspire anyone to write a good book. She's going to be here July the 1st. We hope we see you then as well. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy your day.